Okay, we won't be here long. Okay, I'm going to call the Energy, Utilities, and Telecommunications Committee to order. And with that, Representative Koya, would you lead us in prayer?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Can we pray? Dear God, thank you for this day. Thank you for this committee. Please bless everyone in this room. Bless our chairman and the leadership. Please guide this meeting. Therefore, Lord, unto thy hands I commit this meeting. This I pray in Christ's name. Amen.
Representative Koya and I had a conversation a few days ago, it might have been last week. And I just thought I'd mention this. I don't know, and I assume this is still part of our house rules. And I just want to mention this for the newer people. I don't know if everybody's aware. Conversations we have on the floor of the in the chamber are privileged information, and so I'm not going to say anything about what we talked about. Well, I can say what we talked about, but not the content of it. But I'm just saying that so people will know, because you may not know that if we have a conversation on the floor, you can't go out and say, I had a conversation with Representative Smith or whatever about, and we talked about this. So just so people will know that it's privileged information. Just thought I would pass that out. We have a bill in the committee's House Bill 300 that I had anticipated, had planned having a hearing on today. We're going to hold this bill in the committee for a while. We're just going to hold this bill. So House Bill 300 will not be heard today. Which leaves us, Chairman Martin indicates that he may have other things to do more important than being here. Is that what you're saying? Oh, okay. Well, for those who do, and I know we're all very busy, we have a lot of things going on right now. But we will not have that bill. And with that, from GTA, we have Jessica Simpson here to make a presentation on the progress of broadband in our state. And I think in particular, maybe the funding and how the funding process, or whatever you would like to tell us, what you think is important for us to know. And of course, here again, for those that are new to the committee, it was in this committee in the Georgia House of Representatives, and in this committee is where the conversation about rural broadband, and it's not just rural broadband, there are urban areas too that there have been problems with the lack of broadband. That's where the conversation about this started about 7, 8, maybe 9 years ago. So a lot's happened during that time. And I know there are people who do have broadband access now that didn't have it then, but there's still, according to what I have seen, there's still vast areas of the state where the broadband access is not available. And but the funding is becoming, and that's always been the big part of the issue, because the funding for rural broadband or any of these places where it's not available, I mean, this is how I see it anyway. The funding could only come from public funding, or I mean, it could come from loans, but as far as the reality of it, or it could come from subsidization by other users who already have it for a particular company, other subscribers subsidizing it for those who would be a higher cost. And fortunately, over the last few years, the public funding has become much more available, and which is a real blessing. With that, if you would make your presentation. Yes, that's just fine.
Presentation display, and we'll go and get started.
Something's having, I see a flash up there.
Maybe it's one of the. it's one of the things.
Give us a minute here.
There we go. Well, thank you again. Well, as Chairman Parsons mentioned, my name is Jessica Simmons. I serve as the Deputy CIO for Broadband and Special Projects at the Georgia Technology Authority. As many of you know, broadband is really a partnership between a number of state agencies. And over the last couple of years, we've seen that even expand. And so with that, one of the first things I really just wanted to highlight that Chairman Parsons also mentioned is the great work that the General Assembly has done to put us in the position that we are in today of really laying the foundation and the groundwork for the state to be prepared for the generational funding that we've received and are currently working with the Governor's Office of Planning and Budget to allocate. The number one thing, the best tool that we absolutely have is a location level broadband availability map. And so that's what you're looking at here on the screen. The dark orange areas are obviously locations or census blocks that are considered served at based on Georgia law, which requires 80% of locations within a census block to be served for us to shade that census block as served. The reason why that's important is previously, prior to their new map coming out a few months ago, the FCC, when they were only doing things at the location level or the census block level, considered a census block served if one location was served within that census block. So it's obviously leaving a lot of locations behind. Georgia, obviously, in Senate Bill 402 set a much higher standard for our shading to make sure that we really were making sure that an area was vastly more served than obviously the FCC definition. But beyond that, really what's important is really understanding service availability at the location level. And so that's what we have on the right-hand side here. We call it the red dot map. But so you on DCA's website, the Department of Community Affairs, who hosts the website for the broadband map, you can go and use their website. It's a very interactive map and tool. And so you can scroll into the furthest layer and you can see down to the location level if we're marking something as served or not. And so the red dots represent an unserved location. And the reason why all of this is so important is with all of the funding that the state has received, it's incredibly important to make sure that we're using data to make sure that funding is allocated in the most strategic fashion, getting to the locations that certainly need it the most. And so you'll see obviously in a couple of my future slides where funding has been applied, and you'll see that everything kind of layers very well together, but solely based on this data. That again, the creation of this in 2018 with obviously not, knowing that there was going to be a pandemic and the connectivity was going to be even that much more important a few years later. But, again, with the passage of Senate Bill 402, it really set Georgia up to be well prepared to really, first of all, from a data perspective, understand what locations had service and what locations didn't. And so with that, the first grant program that the state ran using ARPA funding, so American Rescue Plan Act funding, was the grant round that Governor Kemp announced back in 2021 that then ultimately the awards were announced in early of 2022. At that point, there were 3 grants that the governor stood up simultaneously for water, sewer, economic impact, and then obviously broadband infrastructure. And so looking at the broadband infrastructure grant, specifically within ARPA, this is state fiscal recovery funding. And so with that, Governor Kemp announced over $400 million in preliminary awards on February 1st of 2022. And that was to get to over 175,000 locations, with the vast majority of those being unserved or underserved. Just to highlight, unserved is a location that does not have broadband where it meets at least a 25.3 benchmark. So 25.3 megabits in the download and 3 megabits in the upload. An underserved location, which is something that we're looking at, is I'll talk a little bit more in the future about how we're looking at federal programs, is a location that doesn't hit 100 by 20. So it'd be 100 in the download and 20 in the upload, which is really kind of based on a lot of the federal guidance really kind of becoming the new threshold for broadband service. And so with that, when you look at this, just the single grant program that the governor allocated funds for, including the private matching funds for these grants, almost $700 million was invested just from this state fiscal recovery fund grant alone for broadband projects in Georgia. And with this, there we go, screensaver. With this, all of the projects have to be completed by the end of December of 2026. However, based on timelines and internal tracking within OPB, many of these projects are slated to be done much sooner than this. This is just the absolute deadline if these projects are using this funding that these projects have to be completed by. The next fund that I want to speak about is called the Capital Projects Fund. And that is another subset of funding within the American Rescue Plan Act for connectivity. Many of you might remember Governor Kemp back on January 4th of this year just announced an additional $234 million in last mile broadband funding. And that is from this program, the Capital Projects Fund. This program worked a little bit differently than the State Fiscal Recovery Fund grant program, where one thing we're seeing is kind of the further we get into kind of the grant programs using these federal dollars, there is more federal oversight. And so we actually had to get this particular grant plan approved by United States Treasury to be able to move forward with it. We did get approved for $250 million for last mile broadband grant projects. Obviously, the governor awarded $234 million in this first round. And so later this week, there will be an announcement about announcing a second round, obviously a much smaller round, to get us to the full allocation of that $250 million for capital projects. With this program, we targeted specifically just unserved locations. And the way that we actually designed this program was, again, using the Georgia Broadband Map and the data within it. We looked at the counties within the state that were the most unserved. And at that point, obviously, knowing that we had a capped amount in $250 million, and with cost modeling, seeing roughly how far we thought that was going to go, 33 counties and the unserved locations within those counties were essentially preliminary eligible counties for the program. Again, really targeting the most unserved with this particular fund, knowing that we have future money that I'll speak of in just a moment coming to be able to address, obviously, the many other gaps that we know that exist within communities that just weren't meeting the metrics for this program of the absolute most unserved. Ultimately, for the $234 million that the governor announced for this program, including private matching dollars, more than $450 million for this program is going to ultimately be invested in last mile projects, which means homes and businesses in the state of Georgia. And again, these projects have to be done by the same timeline of December 31st of 2026. But again, many projects are slated to be done much sooner. So you can see these two programs alone that Governor Kemp announced, obviously in early 2022, and then obviously last month, coupled with the private matching funds, just these two grants alone are going to invest over $1 billion for unserved locations and getting connectivity to our most unserved within the state. And so in addition to that, just to show you where the areas were that are being funded with this, just to take a moment to explain what you're looking at here on the left with the map. Obviously, that's got a lot more shading than the last one we looked at. So again, you're looking at served census blocks that are indicated with orange. The lighter yellow is an unserved census block. Any gray area, so essentially if you look in the southeastern part of the state, anything that's grayed out is actually anything where we are seeing that there's not a serviceable location. So a lot of those could essentially be forest, swamp, but those are just areas that don't have any serviceable locations. And then what you're looking at is the kind of Kelly green color is a particular fund out of the FCC called the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, which was a grant program that was run in 2020. So that is a currently existing binding federal program that is going to be funding broadband projects in Georgia. In addition to that, the ARPA grants that we mentioned, the State Fiscal Recovery Fund grants, a part of the $400 million that I first discussed, are the dark green. And you can see obviously the areas that get filled in based on those. And then you'll see on the right-hand side, it's where you can kind of essentially see, we're still working on getting our overlay of our maps, but so you can see on the left-hand side, primarily where you have your light yellow census blocks, really indicating obviously your most unserved areas. You can see how that pairs up with our capital projects funding map of the awards that the governor announced earlier this year, and it really fills in a lot of those gaps. And so essentially when those projects will be done, those census blocks will be completely shaded as served as well. And so that really shows the depiction of not only, the funds that Governor Kemp has awarded within the last couple of years, but then also any other federal program right now that has essentially an enforceable and binding funding commitment to the state for broadband. With that, however, there still is the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. Lots of different names for the bill, the IIJA, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill, but we call it the IIJA. What this does is this was passed in November, signed in November of 2021. And this provides at least another $100 million for each state for broadband expansion. However, we are expecting, and all cost modeling shows that we're expecting significantly more than that. In total, for this particular program, what's called the BEAD program, which is Broadband Equity Access and Deployment, which will be our next and largest broadband grant round. It's $42.5 billion that is being dispersed to the states to run grant programs to get to all of the remaining unserved and ideally underserved locations within the state. State allotments have still yet to be determined. The state allotments are being determined based on data within the new FCC map. The FCC has been required to create their own location level map. So essentially the federal government has now had to create what Georgia had a couple of years ago, but on a national scale. And that has been somewhat of a difficult process. Obviously, one of the wonderful things that we've been able to use our map for is to do an analysis to essentially validate the quality of the new FCC map. We have found some gaps. There is a challenge process in the FCC mapping process, and it goes through multiple iterations of either challenging the underlying addresses. That's something that we were very active in, making sure that, first of all, we all agree that the same addresses and locations even exist. Initially, we were very far apart on that. Thankfully, now with follow-up iterations of the map, we're much closer on that front. And now there's currently the process of also looking at availability challenges where, for example, if a provider would say that they serve something that based on state data, we might potentially disagree with on that. And so that process is ongoing. But with that, it's with the underlying data within that map that the Department of Commerce's subsidiary NTIA is going to be distributing funding to the states based on the allocations of what's showing as the unserved locations within each state. Again, a minimum of 100 million. However, based on the size of Georgia, based on the number of unserved locations we still have, obviously we're expecting this to be very significant. With that, again, as I mentioned before, with State Fiscal Recovery Fund, kind of the guidance from Treasury is, this is relief money. Here are the rules. Go run your program. Capital Projects Fund within ARPA, again, a little bit more structured of, you have to submit your plan to Treasury. You have to get Treasury approval, and then you have to go execute your plan. What we're seeing with this is obviously we're dealing with the Department of Commerce rather than U.S. Treasury. And so obviously it's a very different process, different federal agency. The notice of funding opportunity for this particular program is more than 90 pages with a lot of rules and preferences that the states must follow as they are implementing their programs. And so we are currently in the process of designing our programs to make sure that we're in full compliance so that we can execute the program and obviously get as much funding allocated to the state of Georgia as possible. As part of our deliverables to actually get awarded our funding, we have to create a 5-year action plan for the BEAD program to essentially do a high-level analysis of how we're going to get to all unserved locations. And then at that point, based on funding projections, then at that point, what we're going to do with the additional funding. In the IHA, it's actually in statute that first we have to go to unserved locations, then underserved locations. And then at that point, if we have any additional funding left over, looking at community anchor institutions. But then also looking at how we blend applications together and come up with kind of the most cost-effective project areas, because obviously you're going to have a lot of unserved and underserved areas that might be very close together, that it might be more economical to obviously, serve those in one particular project. So again, we're working on our 5-year action plan. And the other component of the IIJA is also creating state digital equity plans. And so that is something that we're also in the process of doing. Both our 5-year action plan for BEAD and our state digital equity plan require a great deal of stakeholder engagement and community engagement. And so that's something that we're actually just kicking off right now and working through creating our different listening sessions and events. We're going to handle that on a regional basis, working through the 12 regional commissions. And obviously, certainly hosting a number of obviously virtual sessions as well. But we also want to be very mindful of, our focus is on the lack of connectivity. And so that's really where we have to have boots on the ground and, coming to communities, listening, really finding out, their barriers to access and finding out how we can address that through these programs. And so we have received planning grants from NTIA to execute this work. You'll see we received just over $1.4 million for digital equity planning. That has to be used within 12 months of receiving our award. So that is a little bit of a shorter program. And then there's a capacity grant that will be following that. And then for the BEAD program, those planning funds can be used for a 5-year span. And you can see we're receiving just shy of $5 million on that. That has a much wider range of, obviously that can be used to create our 5-year action plan, but that also can be used for providing additional capacity to our office, obviously mapping. Obviously we are requiring a good bit of strategic consulting work as well with engineering firms. And so that is what we're primarily using that funding for as well. But so with that, I really appreciate the opportunity to obviously let you know about the really exciting movement that I feel like we've had in this space. But again, thank you so much for obviously having the tools in place for us to be able to execute this work. As you can see, we are doing this very heavily based on data and trying to make sure this funding goes where it's the most needed. And we wouldn't be able to do that without the map and the foundation that obviously began in 2018. And then obviously in 2019, with the passage of Senate Bill 2, allowing EMCs to also provide broadband service as well, has made an incredible impact on the state of Georgia, with some of the largest builds underway right now, and some of the fastest builds underway being EMC projects. And so with that, I certainly would be happy to answer any questions that you may have. As you can see, there's been a lot of funding that was allocated last year and early this year already. Again, we're standing up a smaller round 2 just to go ahead and get ourselves to the full $250 million allocation very soon here for Capital Projects Fund. And then we expect that the largest grant program is still yet to come with all of the planning work that we're currently doing with the BEAD program and also the digital equity program as well. But with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you. That's a great presentation. I appreciate it. I'm always pretty amazed every time I hear you present. I'm going to start trying to compartmentalize so I can take maybe the first 1/8 of your presentation. Remember that.
I'm
Get out
happy
the
to
rest
go
of it
back.
next time, going to the next day. That was really good information. I appreciate it. You do have some questions if you don't mind.
Sure, I'd be happy to.
Chairman Martin.
Thank you agreed. Thank you for the presentation. So my question is, when you say we do this, we're using vendors or the folks out there, right, that do this. It's we, the state, aren't necessarily doing it. We're facilitating, correct?
Regarding the grant program.
Well, actually, I mean, we don't run the broadband. I mean, we have the partner people that do that.
Absolutely.
That's what I mean.
Absolutely. So these are grants through the Office of Planning and Budget to either, local governments that have partnered with internet service providers,
Or
local
ISPs.
governments that are actually ISPs themselves, like small municipalities that actually have their own broadband
Right.
networks, which are very few and far between. And then for capital projects fund, for example, we actually, the Office of Planning and Budget awarded the funds directly to ISPs. So the state is not owning the network. It is owned by the awardees of this
Exactly.
funding.
So my question was, and I preface that just to make sure we had that on the record,
Sure.
because I know it'll take some time longitudinally. I think I'm saying that right, over time. But I'm wondering what the take up is. And I don't know if I'm using that right, that term right. I'm wondering what the subscription is.
The
I mean,
take
so-
rate.
Yeah, the take rate. And we may not know that yet, but I mean, obviously there's getting it out there and then there's getting people, to take up on it, but
Mhm.
so that they can make the full use of the infrastructure and also the operators, to maintain the property plant equipment over time. So just, as that becomes available, I think that would really be a great follow-up, to the presentation, but it's great to see, the capital's being deployed in the areas it needs, and just be very curious what the take-up rate is.
Absolutely. No, that's a great question. We certainly would be happy to follow up with you on that. With a lot of these projects, a lot of the projects still might be either in a planning stage or doing essentially make-ready construction, obviously preparing poles if it's an aerial build. I will tell you, based on a lot of the projects, they're really just kind of early in getting started. But we do have a lot of awardees that are kind of in a very different place. I will say, I think it's a very good point because obviously this is all CapEx rather than CapEx and OpEx. So it is something that, as applicants are developing their grant applications, I think that's certainly something that they're factoring in. Of obviously there is a certain take rate that they're factoring in or they're projecting of how they're getting to the numbers they're getting to for submitting these applications. And so that's certainly something that as we get further into these build outs, we certainly can be working with the applicants to certainly check in to find out if they're getting the take rate that they expected, if it's high or low, or if they're kind of where they expected to be. I will say in a recent conversation with one of the awardees, which is a large EMC that's done a great deal of build out so far, based on their model and essentially what they thought essentially a good take rate was going to be for them to feel comfortable to kind of do all of these projects. Obviously, even though there is grant funding, there is a bit of obviously matching funds in there as well. And at least in that one particular project, we've heard that they've been very pleasantly surprised that the take rate is so far much higher than they expected it to be. Not to say that that's every project, but one of the most recent applicants that I've spoken to that's now built to over 20,000 locations within the last couple of years is seeing a very good take rate.
Good. Representative Ward had a question for you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the presentation. Can you please repeat the metrics for the unserved and the underserved locations? I think one was 100 download with 20 upload. And what was the other one?
Yes, ma'am. So based on state law and the way a lot of the programs are structured, anything is considered unserved if it does not meet 25.3. So it's 25.3 megabits in the download and then 3 in the upload. But based on the IIJA and based on essentially Treasury guidance of how we've implemented the capital projects fund, underserved is considered a location that doesn't meet or exceed 100 by 20 reliably. That's another critical component to this is the reliability. So there is actually nothing in state law that discusses underserved. Georgia really just has served and unserved. But based on obviously us implementing federal programs the way that we are, that's where it also brings in that underserved component. And so that's something that once we're able to use this funding to hopefully get to all of the unserved locations remaining in Georgia, then we can use that funding to go and upgrade networks that are not capable of that 100 by 20 threshold.
Thank you.
Let's see. Representative Kennard had a question.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the presentation. The census blocks that are shaded in orange, you said are 80% coverage. Is that based on population or geographical area?
So that is based on the number of locations based on our master address file that exists within that census
Thanks for
block. And so that's based, and the way that we look at a location is a home or business. So we look at it on a location basis. One thing that I will say that I think is important to note is even though Georgia, based on our map, that was really to do a comparison at the time to how the FCC was handling their mapping for us to really kind of generally show the overstatement of service by the FCC. The way that everything is being handled from a grants perspective now, both really how we're supposed to implement the IIJA and then also how the state is looked at implementing capital projects fund. And obviously, as we look to implement the IIJA B program as well, even if a census block is shaded orange, if there are unserved locations within it, that has to be part of our plan to still get to those locations too.
And how is the 80-20 being determined? Who's getting that 80%, who's getting the 20% that's not covered? How is that being determined?
Again, that's based on the number of locations within that block. So essentially, if 80% of the locations that we know based on our master address file exist within that are reported service from a provider, then at that point, that's how the 80% is determined. And obviously, if there's more than 20% of locations that we know exist within that block that a broadband service provider does not indicate that they provide service to, that's how that differentiation is being made. But again, it's just more of kind of an indication of the graphic of just based on how served and unserved is shown based on the state map. But at this point, I think the more important piece of that though is we still do everything based on the location level. And so even if there's one unserved location within a county and every single other location within that county is served, under the BEAD program, it is a requirement that we still have to make sure that getting to that one location is part of our plan.
Thank you.
I see Representative Mandisha Thomas.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman. Thank you for your presentation. So the capital project fund, there's about 16 million left in that,
Roughly about 15, yes, ma'am.
about 15 million left in that. And that's only for unserved.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. With all the data that you have, is there a proposed map of where that 16 mil will go?
Yes, ma'am. So the way that when we looked at essentially the data to see who was part of the preliminary eligible group for the first round, what we did is, again, we're looking at the most unserved in the state. And so there were 5 counties that were part of that, that were not part, essentially, of the 28 awards that the governor made. There were 5 counties that were not awarded, but were part of the initial group that were eligible. And so at this point, we're going to be looking at those remaining 5 counties to see, hopefully to receive competitive applications to hopefully fund those counties. We certainly hope that we have enough funding to get to all 5, but at that point, it's just going to depend on what applications are received.
Representative,
Just a follow-up question. Can you name the counties?
Yes, so it's Calhoun, Eccles, Miller, Webster, and Randolph, I believe. No, it's not Randolph. Let me get to you after the meeting. There's one additional one, but all of that information will be coming out later this
I mean, we only have 159 counties, right?
week.
Representative Koya.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for a great presentation. With Mr. Chairman, I'm still confused. Being new, I think I'll make this request through you. If we can get her presentation materials electronically emailed to us,
Yeah.
so I can take time
Well,
to
I'll
look
ask
through
her if
it.
she can do
and-
Absolutely.
Okay,
Okay,
there were too many acronyms. You got
Yeah.
me confused.
thank you. Good question. Representative Brad Thomas.
So I was just curious, how does emerging broadband technologies fit into this master plan? Because, you don't necessarily have to lay wire for all of it. So, can you kind of maybe go into that a little bit for me?
Sure, absolutely. So based on the programs that have been implemented thus far, based on Treasury guidance, there is a preference for fiber. But there is a requirement to be able to fund a technology that can deliver speeds at the end of the project completion at 100 by 100 symmetrical. And so that's something that obviously a lot of technologies exceed that speed threshold. But so a lot of the technology requirements or preferences have been put forth so far in the guidance that the state has received on how to implement these programs. So again, thus far, in the programs that we have implemented, there is a preference for fiber. And so essentially a vast majority of what's been funded, both through state fiscal recovery funds and then capital projects funds, have been fiber projects with a small set of projects potentially deploying hybrid fiber coax. But I mean, that is something that we're always considering. Last year, we did actually, one of the Georgia Technology Authority, my organization's tasks related to broadband is really setting the state strategy for broadband expansion. And so right as I came into my role in mid-2021, we went through about a 9-month assessment with an expert engineering and consulting firm that is very specific to just broadband, to really study the state of broadband in Georgia, look at different types of technologies, really look to see, kind of do an assessment of where we are today and how do we move forward, and really just providing a lot of recommendations, whether it's looking at our office, looking at different types of technologies. And so as we look to implement the BEAD program, I think that's definitely something that we will be looking at, other technologies potentially other than just wireline, just because the goal of this program is to get to 100%. We have to come up with a plan and submit it to the federal government for approval of how we're going to serve every single location in the state of Georgia. And there are some locations based on cost modeling that based on, you know, it's 2 miles down a private road and you have to cross a railroad track and just all these factors that could make something a very expensive fiber build, that, you know, some locations based on some of our cost modeling for previous projects have shown that there could be locations that could be, you know, very expensive to serve. And so the IIJA, actually, the BEAD program contemplates this, where they discuss extreme high cost locations, and there's different ways and methodologies that through this program we can work to address those. The goal is to obviously use this funding to put in the most future-proof type of technology, just so that, you know, with you know, really generational funding, I don't foresee that there's going to potentially be a lot of federal funding, you know, down the road to kind of come in, fill in gaps. And so we want to try to use a type of technology that's going to be the most long lasting and for the investment that we're going to be making. But with that, you know, obviously I think that we're going to have to look at other types of technologies to serve some of the most remote and certainly the extreme high cost outliers that exist.
Is there any idea of what kind of wind down there is for taxpayer subsidies for this expansion? I mean, is it every year I'm going to look at $250 million of taxpayer money to subsidize this, or is there eventually we got to get to everybody? I mean, is there any projection of what that's going to be?
So the goal with the BEAD program is to get to everybody, and that's the $42.5 billion that NTIA is going to be allocating to the states. That is another complexity, though, that we are working with the federal government very closely on, is just as the states are getting all of this funding to implement a very large scale grant program, there are still other federal broadband grants out there. There are broadband grants and loans through the USDA. The FCC still potentially has money to do another round of the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund that you can obviously, we had a lot of awards of that in Georgia as well. And so I certainly can't speak for the federal government, but the money that the state has received for broadband at this point, minus our 15 million, has been allocated. And at this point, now we're looking at obviously the IIJA BEAD program. And at that point, to my knowledge, we have not heard of anything that will be following this, except for obviously other federal grant programs that still do exist that potentially existed before this program.
Thanks.
I'll ask you, I got a couple questions here. On this, you had mentioned the Rural Digital Opportunity Funds. Now, is that something that's ongoing, or that money was all distributed? Or what about that particular program?
Yes, sir. So that is a rather complex program that's being run out of the FCC, where it was a reverse auction,
Out of where?
the FCC.
Okay.
And
FC.
so that was a reverse auction that was run in 2020, but then some based on essentially approvals of the company's background and kind of vetting and qualifying providers on that front. Some companies didn't get approval until 2021, and sometimes late into 2021. And so with that, that is a multi-year program that potentially has build outs that are longer than our requirements of being complete in 2026. And so that is something that we're monitoring very closely. We have had one rather large RDOF default in the state of Georgia. And so at that point, that opened up that area for us to then be able to look at that and assess if those counties then met our metrics for capital projects funding. So that is something that we are monitoring very closely, just because for the BEAD program, areas that have rural digital opportunity funding are ineligible, even if they are still currently unserved to this day. And so we're going to be watching very closely to the best of our ability to make sure if it looks like a project could potentially default, working with NTIA to see there is a waiver process, to see if there is a possibility that we could step in and see if it could become eligible for this program, just because with the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund having a later timeline than our deployment for state fiscal recovery funds or for capital projects fund, we really want to make sure that we don't leave anybody behind just because an area might be currently blocked with RDOF, but it might not. It certainly has the possibility to not come to fruition based on the long timeline of that program.
Well, you said default. Are you saying that the company defaulted and went bankrupt, or it defaulted on the program itself?
The company actually, to my knowledge, went essentially closed. They went bankrupt, and
Okay.
they were trying to transfer their RDOF to another subsidiary, and the FCC wouldn't let them do that. So at that point, the award essentially was taken away.
Well, I think that you talked about this, but so under that program, it's my understanding that there are, and don't have to name the companies or anything like that, but it's my understanding that because of the way that worked with a reverse auction, that some entities got areas much cheaper than what they could actually would cost to provide the broadband, and literally have those, like you said, you can't. That makes those areas ineligible for some of this other funding. So we do have areas still like that because of that reverse auction where some entities got the, in my terminology, claim an area on a fairly a small amount of money compared to the cost of the whole project. So we do have areas where they're kind of locked down like that. Is that correct?
That's correct, based on how the BEAD program has been rolled out, that it's explicitly stated in the notice of funding opportunity that areas that have a commitment for a rural digital opportunity fund award are ineligible. However, again, I think that we have mechanisms where we can, again, closely monitor how project build outs are happening, timelines, working with internet service providers and getting updates the best we can so that anywhere that we're concerned about, I think that that's something that the state is going to have to work with the federal government on, because we certainly don't want to allocate all of this funding and then we have RDOF defaults in, 2027, 2028, and we still have unserved locations. And so we were just in DC for a conference on this very topic last week. And so we were talking with NTIA about this, and also a bunch of other states, of just mechanisms and tools that other states are using to potentially avoid this. And so it's a very widely discussed topic, and I think that hopefully we'll all collectively come up with a solution.
I wanted to ask you too, you and I had discussed this. I want to make sure I understand. You probably said this again in your presentation, but on this Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Acts money, if I'm not mistaken, the way that works is the amount of money will be based on the FCC map. Is that correct? But
Yes,
then
sir.
once that amount of money is determined, then the distribution of it will be determined through the Georgia map. Is that correct?
That is, but we continue to receive kind of shifting guidance on that front.
Okay.
So we are going to be able, it's our understanding currently that we will be able to use the Georgia map for funding allocations. However, that's why it's so critical that we have such a good resource though in the state map, because currently not to get too far in the weeds here, but so, essentially the fabric is what the FCC calls their master address
Right,
file.
Yeah, I saw.
And
seen-
so if a location, for example, my address is actually still currently wrong in the FCC map. If a location, if we believe it exists, but the federal government and the FCC map believes that it does not exist, then even though essentially at that point, there is no ability to even challenge if availability is there or not, because fundamentally, we're not even on the same page that we agree that there's a house or business in that location. And so what we're currently actively working on, with Carl Vinson, who's our mapping vendor, and then also CTC, who is one of our engineering consultant, what we're working on is to challenge the map, because ultimately challenges at this point won't affect our funding allocation. However, we need to get the federal government to realize that there's a house right here, because if they don't recognize that there's not a house right here, then they're not going to allow us to come and use that funding to get service to this house. And so while we will be able to use our state map, for a number of aspects of the program, we can't apply funding to any location that A, they don't believe exists, and then B, secondly, any location that they believe is already served. And so that's why the best use of our map right now, which has been just critical, is for us to be able to use that to challenge the map, to show that, we believe there's a location here, even though you say that there isn't. Or, you say that, provider A reported to you that this location was served. Well, we don't have that in the Georgia map. And then, and as part of the challenge process, we've been working with consultants to then go to that provider's website, and then they look it up, and it's also not listed on the provider's website that they serve that address, but they've reported that to the FCC that they have. And so that's kind of what the challenge process is right now, where ISP, states, and the FCC are all working together to facilitate that challenge, to try to get the map as accurate as possible. So by the time we actually do get to the grant program, based on our plans that we're creating for this, our timelines for these plans, and then getting our grant plan approved, I would think that it's going to be no earlier than late this year, early next year, that we'll actually be running a grant round with our funding. And so at that point, there is a good bit of time for us to really adjudicate a lot of these issues, so that, if we believe that houses A, B, and C are here, and the FCC says that only houses A and B are there, that way it gives us that time to fight for house C, to make sure that at this point, it's not going to impact our funding allocation, but it is going to impact our ability to be able to actually fund an internet service provider to come serve house C. And so that's what we're actively doing. And so there has been somewhat changing guidance on if we can use our map or not, but really the critical component is to make sure that we all agree on the locations. First of all, that the building exists, and then, understanding, really kind of coming to a final determination, working with the FCC, the internet service providers, and then obviously our process to agree that they're either served, unserved, or underserved.
I have one more question, if
Yes,
you don't
sir.
mind. That is about the speeds.
Mhm.
I can't remember how we actually refer. To me, 25 is receive and the 3 is download.
Yes. So upload.
Upload. That's right. Upload. So the federal definition is 120. Is that correct?
No, sir. So according to the FCC, the baseline for service is still at 25.3. The
It is.
FCC has had a lot of discussion about potentially moving
Okay.
the threshold there, but they haven't taken action on that. And then within the IIJA, they actually defined it in the legislation that unserved would be any location that doesn't have at least 25/3, and then underserved would be any location that doesn't have 100/20.
Okay.
And so the federal definition is still at 25.3. Our state definition is still at 25.3. And personally, from a policy standpoint, I think that some states are going ahead and upping their speed. I think it makes sense just to follow suit once the federal government does it. However, they've already essentially done it by putting it in the statute for, of how we have to allocate such significant funding.
Well, thank you. I think there is another question, if you
Sure.
don't mind, and I'm not sure who it is. Who's number one? Yes, ma'am.
I just have two quick questions. One, what percentage of the map has a discrepancy in it in terms of, what the FCC sees, what you all see, and then what the provider sees?
So it depends, it
Yeah.
depends on what version you look at. I can't, I apologize, I can't give you a great percentage, but for example, to tell you, so in version 1 of the fabric, we were off by hundreds of thousands, if not over 1 million locations of what we believed actually existed.
Okay.
And when we boiled that down, when we were looking to actually do our fabric challenge, you know, for example, I joke about it, but my address, my address is served. So it's not worth fighting over that location or any other served location because we're not going to get funding for any served locations. And so at that point, what we did is immediately looked at it with our mapping vendor to say, okay, so if the fabric's missing a lot of addresses, but they're served locations, it's not worth the time and effort to fight those because we can't fund them anyway. So what we really did is we honed in on the number of locations where we saw that they were unserved, but they were not showing up in the fabric. And so based on version 1 of the fabric, again, rough numbers, it looked like we were off from their fabric by about 220,000 locations, meaning that Georgia and our mapping process showed that there were 220,000 more locations than the FCC believed existed. Obviously, we submitted challenges on those based on, there've been a lot of limitations in the data that we have, also based on intellectual property and different master address file providers and what we can provide and what we can't. But so what we did is we pulled in some public sources. And so we challenged almost 200,000 locations within the fabric. But in the meantime, the FCC actually was behind the scenes working on a second version of the fabric to begin with. And it was just something that I think they needed to go ahead and roll out version 1, but they were already actively working on version 2 behind the scenes. And so when version 2 of the fabric came out, and we had our vendor look at it, we then were showing a discrepancy of about 37,000 locations, and that was served and unserved. So that shows you of how drastically how drastically improved in just that one process. And so that's where we're currently actively working with them to really true up those final addresses. But I will say, based on the work that they've been doing and kind of the behind the scenes work to roll out the additional iterations of the map, again, even just from Fabric 1 to Fabric 2, there was a very significant jump in the improvement of the quality. So I think by the time, I do fully believe by the time we get to the point that we're actually allocating funding, I think we're going to be very close based on what they have and what we're seeing in the data.
I guess I'm just like trying to figure out how big the bucket is. Like, how many locations total is our estimate as of right now? So like 220,000 out of like 500,000 is very, it's like very different than 220,000 out of like 7 million,
Yeah.
So I'm just curious. I don't know. I have
Well,
no
so
idea.
the issue with the allocation is that it's very difficult, and obviously there's a lot of kind of public estimates out there. I don't really like to talk about numbers just because we
Fair.
really don't know. But the thing about it is, not only is it going to be our actual dollar amount going to be determined on how many unserved locations they're showing for us in Georgia, but also that's also comparative relatively to what every other state is showing as unserved, and then trying to figure out a percentage of who gets what. And so again, the one thing I feel very confident of is we are getting well north of $100 million, but how much more than that is going to be determined based on the allocation. Again, it all depends on how they look at it, but we do feel much more comfortable based on the second version of the fabric that we feel the accuracy is at least getting much better. So and they will be doing their allocation off of the second version of the fabric. So we do feel comfortable, at least on everything that we've seen at this process, that we do feel like, at least initially of what we're aware of, that we think we should be getting the appropriate amount based on our number of locations.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you coming. You did exactly what I hoped you would do. I mean, I knew you'd make a great presentation, but you've given us the information that we were looking for, and I appreciate you and the office there. You really don't know how much, because like I said, we've been, I just remember 7, 8 years ago when we started getting, and Gloria Frazier over here, she was one of the people that kind of started bringing the problem to us and identifying the problem in rural Georgia, which I didn't really know about because I live in Cobb County. Susan Holmes, who's not on the committee anymore, she didn't run for re-election. She was definitely another who was right on the forefront of that. And, the providers, they gave us good information that they had, but all they could tell us basically was that the problems and the reason they couldn't I mean, people didn't understand that. I'm sure a lot still don't, but I mean, I think a lot more people didn't understand then why they couldn't get broadband. I think they have probably a better understanding in general now than they did then. And, you know, I mean, this is why it's a problem, why we can't get it out to you. And there was really nobody to go to then. And so I mean, for me, it's just the best thing to have you there, that you can come and give us this information, that you're a resource for us when we need to get more information. And I want to say too, I know your name very well, Jessica Simmons. I believe I introduced you as Jessica Simpson. And I think
That is not the first time that has
I
happened.
think she's
so
some kind of
I-
entertainer. There's Jessica Simpson, right? And
I was gonna say that happens all the time.
And I hope my wife's not watching on the web, because she will get all over me for that, for getting a name wrong, because I do it all the time.
Oh,
And,
no worries at all. The last thing I was gonna say is, my contact information is here, and if anybody has any questions, I'd love to certainly be able to address those or answer them offline too. So,
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
thank you, sir. Thank you to the committee.
And with that, anything from the committee? Otherwise, we are adjourned.